We woke up one morning in January 1898 to see the Navarre floating by, the ship that Charles Brower had to leave when it was caught in the ice in August. She was about 3 miles offshore, and a big crowd of men went aboard. There was nothing much to salvage because earlier Brower had sent dog teams out to get the men who had stayed aboard her and to collect any remaining food and provisions. That had been many weeks before, when the Navarre had been blown offshore of Cape Simpson near the Newport and the Fearless. Now in January, the one thing worth salvaging was 250 tons of coal. Brower gave orders that evening that the next morning every man would be ready with his harness and every sled would be used to haul that coal ashore. After Brower gave those orders, we met 2 men going out to the ship. They were warned not to go. The wind might shift and they would be taken off. However, they went out anyway, hunting over the ship below decks. They used rolled-up papers for torches. When these burned down close to their hands, they would drop them on the deck. In this way, the ship was set afire. Seeing a ship on fire at night is a fine sight with all her ropes and yards lit up. But it's hard for shipwrecked men to be forced to stand by helplessly while tons of much-needed coal are burnt to ashes. One of the men responsible was a Hawaiian, an old-time whaler. He should have known not to drop burned paper on a ship. The other fellow was a farmer, and maybe he didn't know any better. All kinds of punishment were threatened, but nothing was done. They were only given strict reprimands. The remains of the Navarre stayed there all winter. Sometimes during the winter, 2 Eskimos arrived at Barrow. One of them was a trusted friend of Charles Brower. The other was Pisha, the man who'd been whipped the winter before at Herschel Island. Pisha had worked previously for Brower and was a good whaler. Of course, Brower soon heard about Pisha killing the little girl, but hoped there might be another side to the story. If nothing else, he believed that some white man was at least partly guilty in selling liquor to Pisha. We did not like having him in the community. Besides, there were rumors that he had killed more people. This is what had happened. After leaving Herschel Island, Pisha finally arrived at a hunting camp not far from the eastward of Point Barrow. There were 2 families at the camp, 2 hunters and their wives, 4 children, and an old woman who was blind. Pisha immediately killed the women and children. When the hunters returned at the end of the day, he killed them. He told the old woman that if she ever told anyone what had happened, he would kill her too. The blind woman finally got to Barrow, and after a while she told the story. Brower felt it was a matter for the natives to take care of, and a few months after the shipwrecked crews left, a relative of one of the murdered hunters was given the job of shooting Pisha. Pisha was captured and tied up. He was lashed to a sled, and when he saw Charles Brower, he asked Brower to stop the men who were dragging him to the graveyard, but there was nothing Brower could do. Then an old gray-haired Eskimo stepped out with a .30-30 rifle to avenge the deaths of his relatives. He shot Pisha right between the eyes. Pisha fell. Then the Eskimo shot another bullet through his heart. They left him there, and I believe his wife and some relatives buried him later. Pisha's death took place after I left Barrow, but I believe it's worth mentioning because his presence there did not help things much. One afternoon when Brower was visiting our house, he asked about our mess and if we were getting enough to eat. We told him we were, but that we would very much appreciate a little more meat. He said that one of his hunters had to leave 5 caribou that he could not haul on the bank of a river 2 days' travel, 40 miles from Barrow. If we could make arrangements to get them, we could have the 5 caribou for our mess. Apiu was one of Brower's best men, and I were hired to go. Apiu had only 5 dogs, so we borrowed 6 more. Brower gave us food for 5 days. Also one of those old-fashioned coal oil lamps with 2 wide wicks to cook with and 2 gallons of oil. We were to go next day. My clothing consisted of an undershirt, overshirt, muskrat parka, 1 pair of drawers, 2 pairs of overalls, 1 pair of deerskin boots, 1 pair of deerskin socks, and 2 pairs of woolen socks. If I had known then what I know now, I would never attempted such a trip in January or any other time during the winter with such a poor stocking of clothing. Well, next morning we got away to a good start. We traveled all day. I had my first experience seeing and helping build a snow house. It is surprising how quickly a snow house can be built and how much warmer it is than a tent. First, you find the right kind of snow. One fellow cuts and brings it, and the other fellow puts it up. The blocks were stood on their sides in a circle. Then the next rows of blocks are piled closer and closer to the center. The blocks are shaped to have a slanting surface on the inside. It is almost like laying circles of bricks, except that the snow blocks are larger. Finally, a circular block that had been trimmed with a knife is fitted in at the top. There is an opening in one side of the house, and that's exactly big enough to let you get inside. The door is a block of snow. Inside, you put a deerskin where you want to sleep. On that goes your sleeping bag. You arrange the grub box and stove, and then you're all fixed. When we had finished making the house, we took the harness off the dogs and gave them a good feed. Then we got all our sleeping gear and food inside. I started the oil lamp to cook supper. I never was so disgusted with anything in my life. It was terribly slow. When we had finished eating at last, it was nearly breakfast time. It was an awfully slow thing. Primus stoves are used on the trail now, and they're best thing that ever came into this country. I got into my sleeping bag, which had been lent to me. It was made for a man about 5 feet tall. I'm 6 feet 2 inches, so the bag was not so hot on a cold night. We were off again in the morning and got to the river early in the afternoon. After building a snow house and making the dogs fast, we went to look for the caribou, but we couldn't find them. Next morning, I went one way along the bank of the river for about 6 or 7 miles, and Uppy went in the other direction. We returned without finding anything. We packed our sled and started inland in hopes of Uppy shooting some caribou himself. On the third evening, Uppy looked through his telescope and saw a pole quite a ways off. We turned and went in that direction. When we got closer, we knew that somebody had his hunting camp there. It turned out to be Mungie, the chief of the Barrow natives, and Uppy's brother-in-law. He made us welcome and did all he could for us. It was fortunate we got there because our dog feed was gone and there was a storm coming. The storm lasted for several days. Mungie had killed many caribou. He told us we could have as many as we could haul. When the weather got good, we started back with 7 caribou carcasses. It was a heavy load. We figured, however, that the load would get lighter every day as we had to feed the dogs out of this meat. The food we had started out with was all gone. Now I had my first experience in living on frozen meat. It tasted good, but after a meal of it, there would be awful pains in my stomach. I had to eat it, though, because there was nothing else. Uppy would always dip his meat into some seal oil before eating it. He told me to do the same, and maybe I would have no more pains. I did not like the smell of the oil at all, but I decided to do as he suggested. It was awful at first, but it stopped the pains. All right. Before we reached Barrow, I could eat oil as well as he could. We were traveling slowly. We had made a harness out of dog chains and would take turns pulling to help them. Then a storm came. Before we could find the right place for building a snow house, I froze my nose, cheeks, and wrist. During the night, I kicked a hole through the foot of the sleeping bag, and in the morning, both my heels were frostbitten. We were not more than a few hours from Barrow. I was able to walk and could keep up with the dog team. When we arrived at McIlhenny's house with our load of caribou, 2 of the men took my clothes off, gave me a warm bath and something to eat, and put me to bed. Next morning, when they called me for breakfast, I was a little stiff. When I looked in the looking glass, I thought they had called the wrong man. All of the skin had come off my face. It looked like raw beefsteak. My lips were much swollen and raw. My heels were troubling a little too. But what I was afraid of most were my wrists. They were in bad shape, especially my right one. My face and heels answered to treatment quickly, but my wrists would not heal. Both wrist bones had been frozen. It was not long before my left wrist was all right, but it took some time for the right one to heal. And later I was told that I had a narrow escape and could have lost my right hand. My first experience going after caribou is one I have never forgotten. We started out with 5 days' food and were gone 3 weeks. Frozen meat with seal oil doesn't sound good, but when you have to, you can eat most anything. Our emergency food really was not so bad after all. On 2 occasions during the 3 weeks I was away, the officers had asked Charles Brower to send men to look for me because they feared I was lost. He told them that Apiu was an exceptionally good man who knew the country well and would take care of me. Since then, I have hunted and traveled with many natives, but I can honestly say that I have never been out with a better man than Apiu. We remained friends until his death in the early 1930s. Well, the days rolled along, and one day near the end of March, we all had a wonderful surprise. Lieutenant D.H. Jarvis arrived, having been sent by the United States government to take full command of the situation in Barrow. Lieutenant Jarvis had come along with Dr. S.J. Call because a whaling ship arriving in San Francisco in the fall had reported that various ships had been caught in the Arctic ice. The government had outfitted the revenue cutter USS Bear for a relief expedition. And when the Bear arrived at Cape Vancouver, Jarvis and Call purchased a sled and dog team and headed for Barrow 800 miles north. The Bear had left San Francisco before Walker and Tilton arrived there, so Jarvis's major concern for us was food. He arranged to have an entire herd of reindeer driven north to keep us alive. It turned out we didn't need the food, but those deer were a great help to the village later on. Lieutenant Jarvis and Dr. Call held their first inspection the morning after their arrival. They looked over all the men as well as the buildings in which the men lived, and it was not long before things commenced to happen. The men had to be gotten out of the bunkhouse, and there was no time lost about it. Lieutenant Jarvis took over the schoolroom at the Presbyterian Mission and had bunks built there. Then he had the back room of our house fitted out with bunks. He also took over one of the Brower's warehouses and had bunks constructed there as well. Then he got for the men as many new underclothes, socks, and overshirts as Brower could spare, and requested donations from everyone else who had anything to spare, including the natives. The old bunkhouse was torn down and used for fuel. It was good for nothing else, and fuel was at a premium. Lieutenant Jarvis and Dr. Call arrived just when they were really needed. Scurvy had made its appearance. No one can tell what might have happened had Dr. Call not come just at the right time. The men also were getting a little restless, which is not good in a situation of this kind, but this was changed when the lieutenant and the doctors came. They mixed with the men and became friendly with every one of them, and they had the respect of all. But discipline and obedience came first with Jarvis, and we all knew that. One thing he did was make sure that all the men were kept busy. He gave orders that all those who could play baseball give him their names. Those who did not play baseball or some other outside game must witness the games or take walks, but they must not go too far away and must never go inland because of the danger of getting lost. 2 baseball teams were chosen. McGilhenny was captain of one side, and I was captain of the other. Chief Engineer Denny was chosen umpire. He was a former professional baseball player and really knew the game. He accepted under protest. It was either be umpire or carry 10 eider ducks in the snow from the duckling station 10 miles away. From then until we sailed for San Francisco early in August, we all played a lot of baseball. On Lieutenant Jarvis's arrival, Brower turned over his accounts and his authority to the lieutenant. It is a rather ticklish proposition to take charge of a large bunch of men who are just a little dissatisfied when you have nothing with which to enforce rules but your own will. But that's just what Brower had done. Had it not been for him, many of the shipwrecked whalers would be in Barrow yet, out where the wildflowers grow thickest.